Something Doctor Who has surprisingly rarely explored is the storytelling concept of the morality tale. The morality tale is a trope of science fiction which rose to prominence through the emergence of Star Trek in the late 1960s, where a modern-day moral or political message is presented to the audience through a science fiction setting. It's genuinely surprising that the original 26 year of Doctor Who very rarely utilised this trope in the manner that was employed in series like Star Trek, instead mostly opting for small tangents into morality during a broader story, but not doing it fully fledged. There are, however, a few stories through Doctor Who history that do qualify as a proper, full-fledged morality play, and the first one amongst them stands close to the end of the William Hartnell era, and in 1966 decides to tackle the subject of racism, but in a completely different science fiction setting. The story in question is The Savages, and it is genuinely a loud and angry anti-racist tale, but through a few questionable decisions, the opposite effect seems to have been achieved in Doctor Who's most racist, anti-racist morality tale. I've not seen The Savages, and you probably haven't either. It's 4 episodes, alongside 93 others which are currently missing from the BBC archive. If you haven't got a handle on what missing episodes are, then the fact you're watching a video about the William Hartnell era is slightly bewildering. But in a very brief summary, the BBC, as many other broadcasters across the globe did, junked pretty much all their programming after broadcast back in the day, which included much of Doctor Who due to cost-saving measures. 97 episodes of Doctor Who stand missing from the BBC archive as of July 2023. Occasionally, however, episodes may be recovered from overseas sales which happened prior to the BBC's chunking, or from private collectors who managed to get hold of a copy. The Savages 4 episodes, though, are amongst these 97 missing episodes that we currently do not have. So, how did I watch The Savages? Well, the audio of the story exists in the BBC archive due to a fan-made recording from the time, and from that reconstructions have been made. As with the other 93 episodes, I watched LC29, which was Loose Cannon's reconstruction of the story. Because of all this, the chances are you haven't really explored The Savages or know much about it, and for some reason a lot of people who delve into the missing episodes themselves haven't really experienced The Savages either. Coupled with The Smugglers 2 serials later, The Savages is one of the least talked about missing stories. So let's change that, shall we? The Savages is set on an unnamed alien planet where an extremely advanced race of humanoids known as the Elders live in a metropolis of a city. Outside of the city, however, there's also a race of so-called savages who live in caves, hunt for food and are considered primitive. It transpires that the reason the Elders are so advanced is because they kidnap the Savages and use a piece of machinery to extract their life force and give it to themselves. If this premise seems familiar, it's because it's quickly become a trope in science fiction morality plays, with pretty much every play about racism and apartheid following a fairly similar format. This type of story is seen everywhere in Star Trek especially, and even a late 1960s Doctor Who series The Dominators also touches on many of these same story beats. In fact, in Season 1 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which aired just last year in 2022, the episode Lifters Where Suffering Cannot Reach, which while less about race and more about utilitarianism, presents an incredibly similar premise to the one employed in The Savages. However, The Savages predates them all. What The Savages is trying to say is that a group of people shouldn't suffer to enrich another group of people. It's very clear in the message. The message isn't necessarily one about race, because certainly in science fiction this story has been used mainly as a critique of capitalism, and in fact in The Savages, one of the Elders says, "Do you not realise that all progress is based on exploitation?" A seemingly anti-capitalist message. However, what firmly makes The Savages about race is the title itself. The title of The Savages is one of the few examples in Doctor Who history of a title with a double meaning, such as The Woman Who Fell to Earth, referring to both the Doctor and Grace, or The Mind of Evil, referring to both the Keller Machine and the Master. The Savages not only refers to people in the story who are known as the Savages, but also the Elders, who the story reveals to be the true Savages because they are savage for what they do. in the context of British colonialism, The Savages is saying that the people who were truly uncivilized were in fact the British Empire. For a BBC series in 1966, this is a particularly advanced viewpoint, and if this were just a historical about the British Empire, the viewpoint would not have been able to be expressed, that's for sure. But in the context of science fiction, it's allowed to slip through. In fact, the argument that The Savages is just about capitalism is one that the writer Ian Stuart Black often used in defence to shield the story against criticism for itself criticising colonialism and racism. However, we do know for a fact that The Savages is a morality play about racism because it is there right in the text. As stated before, the term savage, while not necessarily a racist term, is one which has a multitude of racial connotations. The term was often employed by colonisers throughout the Age of Discovery and beyond to describe people from places they considered uncivilised, and they called them savages. While our own people, if you go back tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years to the time of the cavemen, have been retroactively given the savage name, the term comes fundamentally from that colonial term toward people of colour. Now, despite the fact the savages are portrayed in the story as more of the caveman guys, it is obvious that the term is being used in the colonial context because we know the working title for the story, and that was one it was originally commissioned with, and it was called The White Savages, implying white as a twist in the vein of they're savages, but they're white. This fundamentally proves that yes, The Savages was written as a story about race, and it is an anti-racist story. There's also a parallel to the much more recent, the Holocaust, only taking place 20 years prior and very rarely talked about publicly at this time. There was a direct allusion by the Doctor between the laboratory where the savages are drained of their life force to a gas oven. In fact, the parallel of the white savages seems even more clear if you think about it in the context of the Nazis being the elders and the Jewish people being the savages. The way many of the elders see the savages is very reminiscent of Nazi Germany, and this is actually shown through the characters of Avon and Flower, who are just two normal people living in the city who are very casual in their speech when it comes to the savages due to a societal-wide indoctrination that they are just inferior beings and the elders are the superior race. It's just taken. I think there's certainly a parallel here with the Holocaust, and I think very likely it was intended, if it was just a small part of Ian Stuart Black's inspiration. What's also interesting is that the elders do seem to be fairly aware that they are draining the savages' life force, and it's not exactly a secret. Everyone seems to know this is going on and is just okay with it. This is incredibly advanced for the time, for a commentary on institutional racism, which you've very rarely seen any of these sorts of morality plays from the time. It's not even like it's just an open secret, it's just open full stop. The elders even brag about it to the Doctor. After which, something very interesting happens with the Doctor. I'd argue that The Savages is an incredibly important episode because I think it's the moment where the Doctor becomes the character we know today. In episode 2, after the moment I just described, the Doctor essentially goes on a massive anti-racist rant. If this speech happened in the new series, it'd likely be clipped up and plastered all over social media and then wheeled out by out-of-touch fans after every high-profile display of racism in the news. But it is an incredibly strong defining moment of the First Doctor that is very rarely spoken about. He is genuinely horrified at what the elders are doing. He says such things as, "They are men, human beings, like you and me," although it appears at the moment you are behaving in a rather subhuman fashion. He is genuinely angry about the situation in a way we've not seen the Doctor be before, but it will become an essential part of the Doctor's character going forwards. The anger displayed here and the tone that William Hartnell uses makes it very clear what the Doctor is saying and what the story is actually about. From a scripting level, The Savages is incredibly forward-thinking, and it's just a brilliant morality tale about racism and apartheid, and Ian Stuart Black should be really commended for that. So then, why is The Savages thought to be, rather ironically after all that, racist? It's a very well done anti-racist morality tale, as I've just outlined. But it comes down to a lot of the serial's production and the choice by director Christopher Barry to use blackface for the elders. While this script through its working title did specify the savages were to be white, it was Barry who envisioned this as a reverse racism story, having the black people be the oppressors and the white people being the oppressed, with the black people actually being white actors in blackface makeup. This was not in the text. This was a directorial choice by Christopher Barry. For a reason that's not quite clear, perhaps due to cost cutting, thankfully, most of the elders don't actually receive the full blackface makeup, although this is what Barry did want. Instead, most only receive light makeup work, appearing mostly as white, with only Jano the main villain, and some of the other background elders receiving the blackface makeup. However, because Jano takes most of the screen time, it doesn't really change things much, except for some reason Jano is black when the others aren't. Has been suggested by fans because the story is missing and in black and white that maybe the elders were painted in different colours such as purple, red or blue, which in black and white gave the effect of vastly different skin tones, which Jano appears as black. However, we know that Barry did interpret the story to be a parable about the apartheid in South Africa, specifically, and wanted blackface for all the elders due to this. The details are vague, but mainly the impression is the main villain is being performed by an actor in blackface, and that is racist, no question about it. What makes things worse is now the race swap has happened, all it's done is just make the black people the villains. Although textually, the Savages is not saying that if black people were in charge it'd be far worse and start using machinery to suck the life force out of white people, the implications of showing what they show on screen does begin to give a rather odd impression. Additionally, it should be considered that often in 1960s television, especially in other early Doctor Who stories, blackface was only really used for villainous characters. So instantly, having Jano in blackface makes the audience think that he's a villain. So yeah, that works, but that's supposed to be a twist. So dramatically, it just ruins this instantly, and it ends up boiling down to, right at the beginning, that, oh, the white people are the good guys and the black people are the bad guys, which completely defeats the purpose of the story and is just racist. While the vast majority of the racist elements are, I believe, down to the production, there is just a few questionable subtextual elements in the Savages that are actually completely down to Ian Stewart Black. I must reiterate that the reading here is very likely not what Ian Stewart Black intended, as the script is unashamedly anti-racist as explained earlier. However, there's more modern interpretations we should consider. Let's talk about the White Saviour, for example. Now, the White Saviour is a trope in media, which is often considered racist, where the enlightened white people come along and help out the uncivilized black people to make them more like themselves. It has roots in colonial history and it's fundamentally racist. However, it has to be pointed out that the realization of the white saviour as a concept has only come about in the past few years. It was not very well known about and understood even 2 decades ago, let alone 6. The Savages' use of the white saviour concept is very likely accidental, but still worth talking about. If you're unfamiliar, as a large part of the resolution of the Savages, the Elders drain the Doctor himself of his life force and Jano absorbs it. As a result, the Doctor's essence is also transferred into Jano, with him beginning to talk like the Doctor, act like him and sort of embody him, which was because William Hartnell was on a week's holiday, so they needed a Doctor stand-in. But the lasting effect into the final episode is that Jano now embodies the Doctor's morality, and because he is now enlightened by someone more civilized, the story is allowed to be resolved as Jano sees the errors of his ways. What makes this somewhat worse is that throughout the entire story, the Elders constantly hold up the Doctor as this incredibly advanced being and revere him almost like a god. So it's very much the Doctor is the white saviour in this situation. As soon as the moral code is transplanted onto the albeit blacked up evil black guy, he becomes good. Again, this part of the story is probably unintentional but does read as problematic all the same, and I do have to criticise Ian Stewart Black for that. And then there is the term Savages itself, which isn't the most politically correct today. It isn't necessarily racist, but using it in the context that the Savages uses it feels icky, especially considering the fact that it is the title of the serial too. Although maybe it would have made the racism allegory a little more subtle, I really wish Ian Stewart Black had used a fictional term to describe the Savages because it's really not aged well. But that's also because it is a product of its time. And as a product of its time, we do have to put the Savages into the context of 1966. Racism in society as a whole was widespread at the time, and don't get me wrong, racism still very much exists today, and we are on an ever ongoing journey to understand it. However, what you had in the 1960s that you don't get today, outside of members of literal terrorist groups, is that pretty much everyone understands that fundamentally it is wrong to be racist. People may not recognise when they're being racist, and we've all certainly spoken to an elder relative who said the sentence, "I'm not racist, but fundamentally everyone knows and understands that racism is bad, even if they don't necessarily recognise it always. In the 1960s, that wasn't the case a lot of the time. A lot of people were quite openly racist and would proudly embrace this as their political view. It was the younger generation, who we'd now actually called the baby boomers, who were the spurriers of change and led the way for society to move on as a whole, but much of the population were racist. One such account we have of that comes from Maureen O'Brien, who portrayed companion Vicky in Doctor Who from 1964 to 1965, about William Hartnell himself. According to O'Brien, William Hartnell was racist and was fairly aware that he didn't like people of colour.
And he was terrible racist and homophobic and all these terrible things that, normally I wouldn't bear. But I can't remember arguing with him because I don't think there was any point. But, we used to work in that public transport place opposite a television centre. And, all the bus conductors and bus drivers who gathered there, and it was their canteen and everything, most of them were of West Indian origin, background. So Bill said the most terrible things. I mean, you just wouldn't believe it.
To their faces or about them?
Oh, about them. And, he'd be arrested now, and quite rightly. But, I had to sort of change the subject or turn it round, I can't remember.
But this was unfortunately expected for a man of his age in the 1960s. He was born in 1908 after all, only 7 years after the end of the Victorian age. His parents were literal Victorians. Maureen O'Brien maintains that although Hartnell did have obvious flaws, she still loved him completely. He, like many others, was a product of his time and a product of society at the time. Now, were there people in 1966 who were the same age as Hartnell who were not racist? Yes, absolutely. And those people should be celebrated and admired for the fact they broke away from what society said and stood up, but the vast majority of people didn't, and they let their prejudice and bigotry in. William Hartnell was one of these. He's someone who we, as Doctor Who fans, love, and revelations about his bigotry shouldn't change that. However, if in a time where society had moved past such bigotry as a whole, and an acting Doctor Who came out with the sort of things William Hartnell would come out with then obviously we'd have to factor that into our views of the actor. It's more than likely that if William Hartnell was a 58-year-old man in 2023, that he wouldn't be racist. And then there's Patrick Troughton as well. And while there aren't any quite so damning accounts about him, he did express his desire to originally perform the Second Doctor entirely in blackface, and that has to be considered too. A lot of stuff was societal. So why is it important then? Because it lends context to the time that The Savages was made in. I think it's remarkable that in 1966 it was even made, and Ian Stuart Black should be celebrated for writing it. Production-wise, the racism comes from societal context though, no doubt about it. Christopher Barry did have the choice not to use blackface for Jano, but he chose to use it. Numerous Doctor Who stories in the 60s use white actors performing in black and yellow face, and it is racist and it is wrong, but it was the standard. If a director didn't think about it, then automatically white actors were just cast in roles, and then makeup did the rest. There were instances where directors did make a stand and did choose to cast people of colour, and we should celebrate them for that. As previously stated, what makes The Savages more complex here is there really was very little reason for Christopher Barry to use blackface for Jano. It seems to come down to, let's have the villains be black because they're baddies. That in itself is profoundly racist because when blackface was used in the series Doctor Who, normally it was for historical people of colour, and it was just white actors cast. It wasn't really given too much thought. The most talked about example of this was in The Talons of Weng Chiang. The reason this one is so shocking to audiences is because it's in colour, it isn't missing, it's one of the most popular eras of Doctor Who, it's one of the most popular stories, it's also, importantly, a decade on from previous uses of Blackface and Yellowface in the programme, so it comes across as incredibly out of place here. However, in the broader context outside Doctor Who, it was still often employed on television at the time. This was the case of a white actor being cast in an ethnic role and makeup doing the rest. It certainly was racist, but it wasn't consciously racist, it was thoughtlessness. That isn't necessarily any better than what happened with the Savages, but it was a conscious decision in the Savages to have the villains just be black, because they're villainous. But here it is distinctly different. Both are bad, but I think that the production of The Savages and the choices made by Christopher Barry were fundamentally and consciously racist, which is so unfortunate when it had to happen to what was otherwise one of the most progressive stories in Doctor Who history at the time, which is why I'd label it the most racist, anti-racist morality tale there is. So, can we actually move past this? There's a lot of talk about past media at the moment, which is problematic, and if it can still be enjoyed for what it was. My personal view is that, especially when it comes to the Savages, you just have to account for everything. If you want to celebrate the achievements of the Savages, you also have to be aware and be able to criticise the shortcomings of the production. A consciously racist decision was made here, and that shouldn't stop people coming to the story because it is a fantastic story, which itself is about the evils of bigotry, prejudice, exploitation, colonialism, racism. And while I did watch the telesnap reconstruction for this video, there are other ways to experience the story without having to see it. There is the narrated soundtrack, which completely cuts out the racist production, as what you're hearing is entirely audio. And then of course there's the novelisation, which has a very similar effect. I do suggest exploring the Savages as a story because it's genuinely a gem tucked away in the William Hartnell era that is very rarely talked about, and it should be, for both the right and for the wrong reasons.